March 14, 1943. A German test pilot climbs into the cockpit of an aircraft that, just 3 weeks ago, was trying to kill him. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress, America's most feared bomber, now sits on a Luftwaffe airfield outside Berlin, bearing fresh German markings hastily painted over bullet holes. His orders are simple but nearly impossible: fly this captured enemy aircraft for 3 days straight, push it to its absolute limits, and find the weakness that will turn the tide of the air war. Because right now, Germany is losing, and these American bombers are untouchable fortresses ruling the European skies. But there's a problem. This isn't just any airplane. It's a machine designed by his enemies, with instruments in a foreign language, systems he doesn't understand, and quirks that could kill him at any moment. He has 72 hours. The clock is already ticking. This is the story of one of World War II's most desperate intelligence missions and the bizarre twist that followed. By early 1943, the Luftwaffe had a serious problem on their hands, and that problem had 4 engines and 10 machine guns. The B-17 Flying Fortress wasn't just another bomber, it was a psychological weapon. Picture this: formations of dozens, sometimes hundreds of these aircraft, flying in tight defensive boxes at 25,000 feet, bristling with 50 caliber machine guns pointing in every direction. The Americans called it a fortress for a reason. Any German fighter pilot brave or foolish enough to attack one head-on faced a wall of lead fired from multiple bombers simultaneously. And the casualties were staggering, not on the American side, on the German side. Luftwaffe fighter pilots, the best in the world at that time, were being shredded. Experienced aces who'd survived years of combat over France, Britain, and Russia were being shot down by American gunners they never even saw. The conventional wisdom said attack from behind or below, but the B-17 had guns covering those angles too. Attack from the sides, same result. It seemed like no matter what angle you chose, you were flying into a firing squad. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe, was furious. In his mind, German engineering was superior, German pilots were superior, German everything was superior. The idea that American bombers were systematically dismantling the Reich's industrial capacity while German fighters fell from the sky was unacceptable. He wanted answers, and he wanted them immediately. But here's what made the situation truly desperate: the Germans didn't actually understand why the B-17 was so effective. Sure, it had armor and guns, but so did other bombers, and they weren't nearly as survivable. Was it the formation flying, the defensive fire coordination? Some new technology the Americans had developed? Without knowing the answer, every countermeasure was just a guess, and guesses were costing lives and losing the war. Then, on February 23, 1943, something extraordinary happened. A B-17F from the 303rd Bomb Group, damaged during a raid over Germany, lost altitude and couldn't make it back to England. The pilot, Second Lieutenant William Weidman, made the decision every bomber crew dreaded. He attempted an emergency landing in occupied Holland. The fortress came down in a field near Zwolle, belly landing hard but mostly intact. The crew evacuated and tried to destroy the aircraft, but Dutch resistance fighters and German troops arrived almost simultaneously. In the chaos, the Germans captured not just the crew but the aircraft itself, damaged but repairable. For the first time in the war, the Luftwaffe had a nearly complete, functional B-17 in their possession. This was the opportunity Göring had been waiting for. Within hours, the bomber was transported under heavy guard to the Luftwaffe's test facility at Rechlin. But transporting it was the easy part. Now came the hard part. Someone had to fly it. Enter Hauptmann Hans-Werner Lerche, and if you're going to hand someone an enemy bomber and say figure it out, he was probably the best choice in all of Germany. Lerche wasn't your typical military pilot. At 26 years old, he was already a legend in Luftwaffe test pilot circles, a man who could take any aircraft, no matter how unfamiliar or dangerous, and extract every secret it held. He'd flown captured British Spitfires, Soviet Yaks, and even attempted to master the quirks of a Polish PZL fighter that nearly killed him when its engine quit at 200 feet. But this was different. This was a 4-engine heavy bomber weighing 65,000 pounds, fully loaded with systems and instruments he'd never seen before. Labeled in English, built using American design philosophy that was completely foreign to German engineering principles. When Lerche first saw the B-17 sitting on the Rechlin airfield, he walked around it for nearly an hour just looking. Not touching, not climbing in, just observing. He later wrote that the aircraft seemed almost alien, like it came from a different world of aviation entirely. German bombers were angular, efficient, utilitarian. The B-17 was curved, with this massive greenhouse nose made entirely of glass panels, and a tail section that looked like it belonged on a completely different aircraft. But what struck him most were the gun positions. Everywhere he looked, there was another machine gun, top turret, bull turret underneath, tail guns, waist guns, cheek guns in the nose. 10 50 caliber Browning machine guns total. He'd flown fighters with less firepower than this thing had just for defense. The real challenge, though, was the cockpit. Lerche climbed in with an interpreter and an operations manual captured with the aircraft and immediately felt overwhelmed. German cockpits were organized with Teutonic precision, every instrument exactly where you'd expect it, every control standardized. The B-17's cockpit was chaos by comparison. Switches everywhere, gauges scattered across the panel in what seemed like random order, and that massive 4-engine throttle quadrant that looked more like something you'd find in a factory than an airplane. He spent 6 hours that first day just sitting in the cockpit, not starting the engines, just touching every switch, reading every label with his interpreter, trying to build a mental map. The fuel system alone was a nightmare. Multiple tanks in the wings, transfer pumps, crossfeed valves, and a complex management system that could easily lead to disaster if you got it wrong. But here's what separated Lerche from every other pilot in the Luftwaffe. He wasn't intimidated, he was curious. While other test pilots might have been overwhelmed by the complexity, Lerche saw it as a puzzle. Every system had a logic to it, even if it wasn't German logic. His job was to think like an American engineer, understand the design philosophy, and master the aircraft on its own terms. On March 14th, 3 weeks after the bomber's capture, Lerche was finally ready for the first engine start. Ground crews had already test-run the engines, but this was different. This was committing to taking this massive machine into the air alone, without a co-pilot, navigator, or anyone who really knew how the systems worked. The 4 Wright Cyclone engines coughed to life one by one, each one shaking the airframe with that distinctive radial engine roar. Lerche ran through what he thought was the correct checklist. There was no way to be completely sure, and then did something either incredibly brave or incredibly foolish. He released the brakes and taxied toward the runway. The B-17 handled like nothing he'd ever flown. It was heavy, sluggish on the ground, and the visibility was terrible from the left seat because of that massive nose section. German bombers gave you a clear view forward. The B-17 made you feel like you were sitting behind a building. At the end of the runway, Lerche pushed the 4 throttles forward, and 4,800 horsepower pulled the Fortress down the concrete. The acceleration was surprisingly slow. This was a heavy aircraft, even without bombs or a full crew. 50 miles per hour, 60, 70, and then at about 90 miles per hour, he pulled back on the yoke and the nose lifted. The B-17 left German soil and climbed into the March sky with a Luftwaffe pilot at the controls, but the mission had just begun. For the next 3 days, Lerche flew that B-17 like his life depended on it, because in a very real sense, it did. Every hour in the air was an hour of data, and the Luftwaffe needed that data desperately. The first day was basic handling, climbs, descents, turns, stalls. Lerche needed to understand the aircraft's flight envelope before he could test its combat capabilities, and what he discovered surprised him. The B-17 was, in his words, remarkably honest. It didn't have any vicious handling characteristics, no sudden quirks that would bite an inexperienced pilot. It flew heavy, yes, but predictably, the controls were light for such a large aircraft, much lighter than German bombers. You could fly it for hours without wearing yourself out, which made sense for missions over Germany that could last 10 hours or more. But then came the performance testing, and this is where things got interesting. Lerche pushed the bomber to its maximum altitude, climbing slowly in wide circles over the Rechlin test range. At 20,000 feet, the engines were still pulling strong. At 25,000 feet, they were laboring but functional. He managed to coax it up to 28,000 feet before the aircraft simply wouldn't climb anymore. This was critical intelligence. Every 1,000 feet of altitude was another layer of defense for bomber formations. German fighters performed best between 15,000 and 20,000 feet. Above 25,000, they were struggling. The B-17 could operate in the thin air where German fighters were at a severe disadvantage. On the second day, Lerche conducted the tests every Luftwaffe fighter pilot desperately wanted to see: attack angles. With ground observers tracking everything and cameras mounted to record the aircraft from multiple positions, Lerche flew simulated attack runs from every conceivable direction. Head-on, he could see why that was nearly suicidal for fighters. Even flying alone, the sight picture from the nose was excellent, and a bomber formation would have overlapping fields of fire that made a frontal attack deadly. From below, the ball turret could track a fighter with surprising accuracy. From above, the top turret had an excellent range of motion. But then he found something coming from high and to the right side. In a diving attack between the 1 o'clock and 2 o'clock position, there was a blind spot. Not a huge one, but significant. The top turret couldn't depress far enough, the nose guns couldn't elevate high enough, and the waist guns had restricted fields of fire forward. A fighter coming from that angle at high speed in a dive could fire a quick burst and break away before most of the defensive guns could track him. This was exactly the kind of tactical intelligence that could save German pilots' lives. But Lerche wasn't done. The third day was the most dangerous: systems failures. The Luftwaffe needed to know what happened when a B-17 was damaged. How did it fly on 3 engines, on 2? What happened if you lost hydraulic pressure or electrical systems? Lerche systematically shut down engines mid-flight, 1 at a time, 3 engines. The B-17 flew surprisingly well, barely losing altitude. To engines on one side, now it got challenging. The asymmetric thrust wanted to pull the aircraft into a spiral, but with enough rudder and trim, he could maintain control. To engines on opposite sides, actually easier than having them on the same wing. He intentionally created electrical failures, hydraulic failures, even fuel system problems. Each time, he meticulously documented how the aircraft responded, what backup systems kicked in, what workarounds were possible. This wasn't just about finding weaknesses, it was about understanding the complete picture of this machine. And here's what he realized sitting in that cockpit at 20,000 feet over Germany: the Americans had built something genuinely impressive. The B-17 wasn't indestructible, but it was incredibly resilient. It could absorb tremendous damage and keep flying. Its systems had redundancies, its structure was overbuilt, and its engines were reliable even when pushed to their limits. This wasn't the news the Luftwaffe wanted to hear, but it was the truth. Lerche's reports landed on desks throughout the Luftwaffe high command like bombshells. Not because they revealed some fatal flaw in the B-17, they didn't, but because they confirmed what many pilots already suspected: the Americans had built a superior strategic bomber, and Germany was in serious trouble. The tactical recommendations were implemented almost immediately. Luftwaffe fighter units received new attack doctrine emphasizing the high-side attacks from the 1 to 2 o'clock position that Lerche had identified. Training programs were updated, gun camera footage from combat was analyzed with new understanding of the B-17's defensive blind spots. And it worked to a degree. German fighter pilots using the new tactics did see improved success rates. But here's the brutal arithmetic of aerial warfare. Even with better tactics, the losses were unsustainable. For every B-17 shot down, Germany was losing experienced fighter pilots it couldn't replace. The Americans, meanwhile, had a seemingly endless supply of bombers, crews, and resources. But the story of that captured B-17 doesn't end with Lerche's test flights. What happened next is almost harder to believe. The Luftwaffe decided to use the captured fortress for what they called ferrying operations, a nice euphemism for psychological warfare missions. They would fly the B-17 near Allied bomber formations, sometimes even slipping into formation, gathering intelligence on tactics, radio frequencies, and formations. German reconnaissance crews flying in an American bomber, hiding in plain sight. These missions were extraordinarily dangerous. If the Americans realized there was a German crew flying a B-17, they'd shoot it down without hesitation. And if German anti-aircraft crews on the ground spotted a B-17 not on the mission schedule, they'd fire first and ask questions later. The captured fortress was equally likely to be killed by either side. The missions were flown by some of the Luftwaffe's most skilled and slightly insane pilots, men who volunteered for what was essentially espionage work at 25,000 feet. They'd fly with the bomber formations for minutes at a time, photographing aircraft positions, noting radio procedures, and then slip away before anyone noticed the extra fortress in the formation. On one particularly audacious mission in March 1944, a German crew flew the captured B-17 near a formation returning from a raid over Berlin. They'd painted it with markings that roughly matched the 91st Bomb Group, and in the chaos and exhaustion following combat, no one noticed the extra aircraft for nearly 20 minutes. They photographed the entire formation, documented damage patterns, and even picked up radio chatter about which German airfields had the heaviest defenses. But the operation came with a terrible cost. On October 12, 1944, the captured B-17 was finally destroyed not in combat but in an Allied air raid on the airfield where it was parked. The irony was almost poetic. An American bomber captured by the Germans, destroyed by American bombs. Hans-Werner Lerche survived the war, though his story after the B-17 flights was almost as remarkable as the flights themselves. He continued testing captured Allied aircraft throughout 1943 and 1944, flying everything from P-51 Mustangs to Soviet bombers. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, Lerche was captured by British forces and spent time as a prisoner of war, but not a typical POW. The British and Americans quickly realized what they had: a pilot with intimate knowledge of both German and Allied aircraft, a test pilot with extraordinary skill, and someone who could provide insights into comparative aviation technology that existed nowhere else. Instead of being imprisoned, Lerche spent his time debriefing Allied intelligence officers, writing detailed reports on German aircraft development, and even advising on post-war aviation programs. He later wrote a book about his experiences called Luftwaffe Test Pilot, and the chapters about flying the B-17 read like something from a spy thriller. He described the psychological pressure of flying deep into enemy territory in an enemy aircraft, the constant fear that every mission could be his last, and the strange respect he developed for American aviation engineering. But here's the part that really stuck with him, the part he talked about in interviews decades later. Flying that B-17 changed his perspective on the war itself. German propaganda had spent years telling the Luftwaffe that American technology was inferior, that German engineering was unmatched, that victory was inevitable. Sitting in that cockpit, flying an aircraft that was clearly, undeniably world-class, Lerche realized the propaganda was lies. If America could build bombers this good, in these quantities, what did that say about the war's outcome? It was a question he couldn't shake, and one that ate away at him during those final years of the conflict. The tactical intelligence from Lerche's flights did help German fighter pilots, there's no denying that. Losses among B-17 crews increased in late 1943 and early 1944 as the new attack tactics spread through Luftwaffe fighter units. But the strategic picture hadn't changed. America kept building bombers faster than Germany could shoot them down, kept training crews faster than Germany could kill them, kept pushing deeper into the Reich while German defenses crumbled. By 1944, American bomber formations were flying with long-range fighter escorts B-51 Mustangs that could accompany them all the way to Berlin and back. The brief tactical advantage that Lerche's intelligence provided evaporated almost overnight. Now German fighters had to get through escorting Mustangs before they could even attempt attacks on the bombers, and that was a losing battle. The story of Hans-Werner Lerche and that captured B-17 is a strange footnote in World War II history, a moment when the machinery of war paused long enough for one extraordinary pilot to truly understand the aircraft that was helping to defeat his country. In 72 hours of flying, Lerche didn't just gather tactical intelligence. He witnessed firsthand the industrial and technological might that Germany was fighting against. He saw American engineering at its finest, not through propaganda or second-hand reports, but through direct experience, muscle memory, the feeling of controls in his hands and engines responding to his commands. There's something almost tragic about it. Here was a man given 3 days to find a weakness that could change the course of the war, who instead discovered respect for his enemy's capabilities. The blind spots he found were real, and they helped, but they weren't enough. They were never going to be enough. Today, B-17s are rare, treasured artifacts kept alive by dedicated preservationists. A few still fly at airshows, their Wright Cyclone engines producing that distinctive roar that once filled the skies over Europe. When you watch one take off, heavy and determined, climbing slowly toward the clouds, it's impossible not to think about those desperate days in 1943 when the fate of nations hung on formations of these aircraft. And somewhere in that history is Hans-Werner Lerche, climbing into the cockpit of an enemy bomber with a mission that was probably impossible, pushing an unfamiliar aircraft to its limits, and discovering that sometimes the most important intelligence isn't about finding weakness, it's about recognizing strength. The question the Luftwaffe should have been asking wasn't how to beat the B-17, it was what kind of nation could build thousands of them, and what that meant for the war's inevitable conclusion. Lerche figured that out in 3 days. Germany took another 2 years to learn the same lesson. If this story fascinated you, hit that subscribe button. We dive deep into the forgotten moments of history that changed everything, the missions nobody talks about, the decisions made in seconds that echoed for decades, and the people who lived through moments that seem impossible today. See you in the next one.